Imagine waking up one freezing morning and realizing that your family has absolutely nothing left to eat. Not bread, not meat, not even a handful of flour. Outside your cabin, snow is piled higher than the roof. The nearest town is more than 100 miles away through mountains buried under relentless winter storms. Your children are crying from hunger. Your friends are dying one by one. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a horrifying thought begins to emerge. A thought so terrible that you immediately try to push it away. But every day, as the hunger grows stronger, that thought becomes harder to ignore. How far would you go to survive? Would you eat your horse, your dog, the leather from your shoes? And if all of that was gone, what then? This sounds like the plot of a horror movie, but it isn't. It actually happened. In the winter of 1846, a group of American pioneers set out for California seeking a better future. Instead, they became trapped in one of the most brutal survival situations in American history. Their suffering would shock the nation. Their story would become legendary, and their name would forever be associated with one of the darkest chapters of Westward expansion. This is the true story of the Donner Party, a story of hope, ambition, disaster, and the terrifying lengths human beings will go to stay alive. America in the 1840s was a nation obsessed with expansion. Across the country, newspapers, politicians, and land promoters spoke constantly about opportunity waiting in the West. The idea became known as manifest destiny. Many Americans believed it was their destiny to spread across the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific. To thousands of families living in crowded towns and farming communities, the West represented something powerful: a second chance. Land was expensive in many eastern states. Opportunities could be limited. But California offered possibility. Stories circulated about fertile valleys, mild weather, and vast stretches of land waiting to be claimed. Whether those stories were completely true didn't matter. People wanted to believe them. And so they packed their belongings into covered wagons and began moving west. The journey was not easy. Travelers had to cross nearly 2,000 miles of wilderness. There were no highways, no gas stations, no emergency services. Everything depended on preparation, luck, and determination. Families loaded their lives onto wooden wagons pulled by oxen. Most could carry only the essentials: food, tools, clothing, weapons, seeds, personal belongings. Anything left behind might never be seen again. For many settlers, the trip represented a one-way journey. There was no intention of returning home. They were leaving their old lives behind forever. Among those dreamers were two brothers from Illinois, George Donner and Jacob Donner. Both men were respected farmers. Both had large families, and both believed California offered a brighter future than the one they currently had. When plans were made for a wagon train heading west in 1846, the Donner families joined eagerly. They were not reckless adventurers. They were ordinary Americans pursuing extraordinary opportunities, like thousands of others. Unfortunately, they were about to make a decision that would turn their dream into a nightmare. In April of 1846, the wagon train departed. The group consisted of dozens of men, women, and children. Some traveled alone. Others traveled with entire families. The atmosphere was optimistic. People laughed around campfires. Children played beside wagons. Many travelers believed they were beginning the greatest adventure of their lives. At first, the journey proceeded as expected. The pioneers followed established trails used by countless immigrants before them. The Oregon Trail was dangerous, but it was well known. Travelers understood the route. They knew where water could be found. They knew where grass was available for livestock. Most importantly, they knew it worked. As weeks passed, the wagon train crossed rivers, plains, and rolling hills. There were challenges: broken wagon wheels, sick livestock, minor accidents, but nothing unusual. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. Then they encountered information that would change everything. Information that promised a faster route to California, a shortcut. And as history repeatedly demonstrates, shortcuts often come with hidden costs. The man behind the shortcut was named Lansford Hastings. At first glance, Hastings seemed trustworthy. He was educated, confident, well-spoken. He had written a guidebook about traveling to California. Many settlers respected his opinions. In his book, Hastings described an alternative route that supposedly significantly reduced travel time. The route would later become famous as the Hastings Cutoff. To exhausted travelers, the proposal sounded irresistible. Why spend extra weeks on the traditional route when a shorter path existed? Every day saved could be important, especially with winter eventually approaching. However, there was one major problem. The shortcut was largely untested. Very few wagon trains had ever attempted it. Even more concerning, Hastings himself had never successfully guided a large wagon train through much of the route. Several experienced frontiersmen advised immigrants to avoid it. They warned that the terrain was difficult and dangerous. But warnings are easy to ignore when people believe they have discovered an advantage. Many members of the wagon train debated the decision. Some argued for staying on the established trail. Others believed the shortcut offered significant benefits. Eventually, the Donner families and many others chose the Hastings Cutoff. At the time, it seemed like a smart choice, a reasonable choice, perhaps even a necessary choice. None of them realized that they had just made the most serious mistake of their journey. One decision, one fork in the trail, one moment that would ultimately determine who lived and who died. Almost immediately, problems began to appear. The shortcut was nothing like what settlers expected. Instead of smooth travel, they encountered difficult terrain that slowed progress dramatically. Dense forests blocked the path. Massive trees stood directly in their way. The pioneers were forced to stop repeatedly and clear routes by hand. Men spent entire days chopping trees and removing obstacles. Wagons moved forward only a few miles at a time. What was supposed to save time was actually costing them valuable weeks. Frustration spread throughout the group. Many settlers began questioning the decision. But turning back seemed impossible. Too much time had already been lost. The wagon train continued deeper into unfamiliar territory. Then, conditions became even worse. Ahead lay one of the most hostile environments in North America, the Great Salt Lake Desert. Unlike a typical desert filled with sand dunes, this region was an enormous expanse of barren salt flats. Water was scarce. Shade was almost non-existent. Vegetation was limited. Crossing it would test every person and animal in the expedition. As the pioneers entered the desert, temperatures soared. The heat was relentless. Wagon wheels sank into soft ground. Oxen struggled under heavy loads. Water supplies disappeared rapidly. Travelers pushed themselves to the limit. Day after day, they moved through a landscape that seemed determined to destroy them. Animals began dying. Some wandered away and were never found. Others collapsed from exhaustion. Each dead ox represented a disaster. Without livestock, wagons could not move. Without wagons, supplies could not be transported. And without supplies, survival became increasingly uncertain. The desert crossing lasted far longer than expected. Families rationed water carefully. Some became dangerously dehydrated. Others suffered from heat exhaustion. The psychological effects were just as severe. People argued. Tensions rose. Confidence in the leadership began to fade. When the wagon train finally emerged from the desert, the results were devastating. The settlers had lost precious livestock. Valuable supplies were gone. And perhaps most importantly, they had lost time. Lots of it. The shortcut had failed. Instead of reaching California sooner, they were now significantly behind schedule. Winter was getting closer. The Sierra Nevada mountains still lay ahead, and the pioneers were beginning to realize a terrifying truth. They might not reach California before the snow arrived. At that moment, nobody could have known just how deadly that delay would become, because high above them, in the mountains ahead, nature was preparing one of the harshest winters the region had seen in years, and the Donner Party was heading straight toward it. By the autumn of 1846, the mood within the wagon train had changed dramatically. The excitement that had once filled their campsites was fading. The laughter around evening fires had become less frequent. People were tired. Their animals were exhausted. Their supplies were running low. And everyone knew they were behind schedule. For pioneers traveling west, timing was everything. Experienced travelers understood a simple rule. You had to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains before winter arrived. Once heavy snow blocked the mountain passes, travel could become impossible. Most immigrant trains planned their journeys carefully to avoid that risk. The Donner Party had lost precious weeks taking the Hastings Cutoff. Now they were paying the price. Every morning, the wagons moved forward as quickly as possible. Families woke before sunrise. Animals were harnessed. Meals were eaten quickly. Then, everyone pushed westward. There was little time for rest, little time for mistakes. The mountains were waiting, and winter was getting closer every day. Yet despite the growing danger, many settlers remained hopeful. After all, California was no longer a distant dream. It was close, very close. The hardest parts of the journey seemed behind them, or so they thought. Because the most difficult challenge of all was still ahead. Nature had one final test waiting for them, and it would prove far more powerful than anything they had encountered before. As the wagon train approached the Sierra Nevada, the landscape began to change. The open plains disappeared. Rolling hills gave way to steep slopes. Massive pine forests covered the mountainsides. The air grew colder. The nights became longer. Travel slowed once again. The terrain was difficult. Narrow trails twisted through rocky passes. Wagons struggled to navigate steep inclines. Animals were forced to pull heavy loads through increasingly dangerous conditions. Still, the settlers pressed forward. Many believed they could beat the weather. If they worked hard enough, if they moved fast enough, if luck remained on their side, they might still reach California before winter arrived. But nature wasn't interested in their plans. On October 28, 1846, the first major snowstorm struck. At first, it didn't seem catastrophic. A few inches of snow was not unusual in the mountains. Some travelers even welcomed it. The snowfall appeared temporary, something they could simply wait out. But then the storm intensified. Snow continued falling, hour after hour, day after day. The trails disappeared beneath white drifts. Visibility dropped. Temperatures plummeted. Animals became difficult to manage. Wagons struggled to move. The settlers suddenly found themselves fighting conditions they had never anticipated. Then came a brief break in the weather. Seeing an opportunity, several members of the group attempted to push through the mountains. They hoped the worst had passed. They were wrong. A second storm arrived. This one was even worse. The snow came down relentlessly. Powerful winds swept through the mountains. Within a short time, the mountain passes became completely blocked. Travel stopped. The Donner Party was trapped. Not delayed, not slowed, trapped. There would be no easy escape, no quick solution, no shortcut to safety. The mountains had closed behind them, and winter had only just begun. As reality settled in, the settlers faced a terrifying question. How do you survive an entire winter in the wilderness? The answer was simple. You build shelter, and you hope it is enough. Several families established camp near a lake that would later become known as Donner Lake. Others remained farther east in makeshift camps. Everyone worked desperately. Cabins were constructed from logs. Roofs were assembled from available materials. Every structure represented a fight against the cold. But the conditions were brutal. Snowstorms continued striking the region. The snowfall became extraordinary. Modern researchers estimate that some areas accumulated more than 20 feet of snow. Imagine standing beside a house completely buried beneath a mountain of snow. That was the reality facing the Donner Party. The cabins soon became isolated islands in a frozen landscape. Moving between them became increasingly difficult. Traveling even short distances required enormous effort. Outside temperatures frequently dropped below freezing. The wind howled through the trees. The mountains seemed alive with danger. Inside the cabins, conditions weren't much better. Crowded spaces, limited ventilation, constant cold. Families slept close together for warmth. Children huddled beneath blankets. Adults worried endlessly about food, because while shelter offered some protection against the weather, it could not solve their biggest problem: starvation. In the beginning, food supplies seemed manageable. Most families had prepared for a difficult journey. They carried flour, dried meat, beans, rice, various preserved foods. But nobody had planned to spend an entire winter trapped in the mountains. The math was unforgiving. Every day required food. Every meal reduced supplies. Every passing week brought them closer to disaster. At first, families rationed their portions. Meals became smaller. People skipped second servings. Children received priority whenever possible. Adults often ate less so their families could eat more. Then the livestock began disappearing. Oxen were slaughtered for meat. Horses followed. The settlers understood that losing animals meant sacrificing future transportation. But survival came first. The meat provided temporary relief. Unfortunately, temporary relief was all it provided. Winter continued. Food continued disappearing. The snow continued falling. Eventually, even the animals were gone. What remained was desperation. The settlers began consuming anything remotely edible. Animal hides were removed from wagons. Leather straps were boiled. Shoes were cut into pieces and cooked. The leather softened into a gelatin-like substance. It tasted terrible. It offered little nutrition. But it was something. And something was better than nothing. As hunger intensified, people's bodies began changing. Weight vanished rapidly. Faces became thin. Energy disappeared. Simple tasks felt exhausting. Many settlers became too weak to work effectively. Others developed illnesses. The human body can endure hunger for surprisingly long periods, but prolonged starvation affects both physical and mental health. People struggle to think clearly. Decision-making becomes difficult. Emotions become unstable. Hope begins to fade. Inside the cabins, conversations increasingly revolved around food, favorite meals, recipes, memories of home. Anything to distract from the reality of their situation. Parents tried to comfort children. Children asked when they would eat again. Many parents had no answer. As the weeks passed, the first deaths began occurring. Some died from illness, others from malnutrition, still others from a combination of both. Each death devastated the community. These weren't strangers. They were neighbors, friends, family members, people who had shared the journey for months. Every loss served as a reminder of the growing danger, and yet winter was far from over. The calendar moved into December. The snow remained deep. Rescue seemed impossible. The settlers were running out of options. Then someone proposed a desperate plan. A plan so dangerous that many believed it was suicidal. A small group would leave the camps. They would attempt to cross the mountains on foot. If they succeeded, they could bring help. If they failed, there might be no one left to save. The volunteers knew the risks. They understood that many of them might never return. But they also knew something else. If nobody tried, everyone would die. And so preparations began for what would become one of the most extraordinary survival journeys in American history. By mid-December 1846, the situation had become unbearable. The snow showed no signs of melting. Food supplies had nearly vanished. More people were becoming sick. Others were too weak to work. Every day seemed darker than the last. Inside the cabins, settlers whispered about a reality they no longer wanted to admit. If help didn't arrive soon, many of them would die. Perhaps all of them. The problem was obvious. No one outside the mountains knew the full extent of their situation. The Donner Party was isolated, hidden beneath deep snow, cut off from civilization. The only chance of survival was to send someone for help. The idea sounded simple. The reality was terrifying. To reach California settlements, volunteers would have to cross more than 100 miles of snow-covered mountains, on foot, with almost no food, in freezing temperatures. Most people considered the journey nearly impossible. Yet impossible was better than certain death. Eventually, 17 volunteers stepped forward. They included men and women, young adults and older travelers. Some left behind spouses, others left behind children. Many knew they might never return. Before departing, they improvised snowshoes from rawhide and wood. The equipment was crude, but it offered their only chance of traveling across the deep snow. On December 16, 1846, they left the camps. The survivors remaining behind watched them disappear into the frozen wilderness. Some believed they were watching heroes. Others believed they were watching people walk toward their deaths. History would remember the group by a tragic name, the Forlorn Hope, and soon that name would prove painfully accurate. The journey began badly, and it only became worse. Deep snow slowed every step. The volunteers sank into drifts, climbed steep slopes, battled freezing winds. Progress was painfully slow. Each mile demanded enormous effort. The group carried limited supplies. Food was rationed carefully, but their calculations quickly fell apart. The mountains were larger than expected. The conditions were worse than expected, and the journey was taking far longer than expected. Within days, starvation returned. People grew weaker. Some could barely stand. Others struggled to keep moving. Still, they pressed forward, because stopping meant death. Soon the first member of the group died, then another, and another. The survivors buried some when possible. Others had to be left behind. There simply wasn't enough strength. The situation grew increasingly desperate. Every day brought new suffering. Frostbite damaged hands and feet. Snow blindness affected vision. Hunger became unbearable. Eventually, the survivors faced a horrifying reality. Without additional food, everyone would die. Modern audiences often struggle to understand what happened next, but starvation changes human behavior in ways most people never experience. The human body prioritizes survival above everything else. As members of the group died, some survivors made a decision they never imagined they would face. They consumed the bodies of those who had already passed away. Not out of cruelty, not out of violence, but out of desperation. It remains one of the darkest and most controversial chapters of the Donner Party story. Yet historians generally agree on one point. Without that decision, the entire rescue group would likely have perished. The survivors carried enormous emotional scars from those events. Some rarely discussed them afterward. Others spent years haunted by the memories. The mountains had stripped away civilization, leaving only the raw instinct to survive. After weeks of unimaginable suffering, a handful of survivors finally approached settlements in California. They were skeletal, exhausted, barely recognizable. But they had accomplished the impossible. They had survived. And now, for the first time, the outside world learned what was happening in the mountains. When news reached California settlements, people were stunned. Many had assumed the wagon train was delayed. Few imagined the true scale of the disaster. The reports sounded unbelievable. Families trapped by snow, starvation, deaths, people stranded high in the Sierra Nevada with winter still raging. The reaction was immediate. Volunteers began organizing rescue efforts. Food was collected, supplies were prepared. Men familiar with mountain travel stepped forward. But reaching the trapped settlers would not be easy. The same storms that had trapped the Donner Party now threatened rescuers. Snow covered the trails. Avalanches remained possible. Travel was dangerous. Nevertheless, rescue teams moved forward. The first relief expedition fought through severe weather and eventually reached the camps in February 1847. What they found shocked them. The survivors looked like ghosts. Many were dangerously thin. Some were too weak to stand. Children stared silently from inside dark cabins. Adults struggled to speak. Months of starvation had transformed healthy pioneers into shadows of themselves. The rescuers distributed food carefully. Giving too much food too quickly to starving people could be dangerous. Small portions were provided first, then larger amounts. The goal was simple: keep people alive long enough to evacuate them. The first rescue team could not take everyone. Many survivors were too weak to travel. Others had to remain behind while stronger individuals left. It was a heartbreaking process. Families were separated. Parents worried about children. Children worried about parents. No one knew whether those remaining behind would survive long enough for another rescue mission. Yet despite the tragedy, hope had finally returned. For the first time in months, survival seemed possible. The first rescue mission saved lives, but the crisis wasn't over. Dozens of people still remained trapped. Additional rescue teams were organized. Each journey into the mountains required courage. The weather remained dangerous. Snow continued covering much of the landscape. Yet rescuers kept returning, again and again, one mission after another. The process was painfully slow. Survivors had to travel through difficult terrain. Many were extremely weak. Some collapsed during the journey. Others required assistance every step of the way. Children were often carried. Adults leaned on rescuers for support. The mountains refused to surrender their prisoners easily. Meanwhile, conditions inside the remaining camps continued deteriorating. Food shortages persisted. Illness spread. Deaths continued occurring. Every day mattered. Every hour mattered. The people still trapped knew rescue was coming, but they also knew rescue might not arrive in time. For some, it didn't. Several settlers died while waiting for the next relief party. Others passed away only days before help arrived. The emotional toll became overwhelming. Imagine surviving months of starvation only to lose a loved one at the very end. That reality became painfully common. By March and April, multiple rescue missions had entered the mountains. Each trip reduced the number of people still trapped. Each trip brought more survivors to safety. But each trip also uncovered new scenes of suffering. The rescuers witnessed firsthand what prolonged starvation had done, not only to people's bodies, but to their minds. Many survivors would spend the rest of their lives remembering those months, remembering the snow, the hunger, the fear, and the people who never came home. Finally, as spring approached and temperatures slowly began rising, the last rescue operations were completed. The ordeal that had begun months earlier was finally nearing its end. The mountains were releasing their grip. The survivors were leaving. But the full story of what had happened during that terrible winter was only beginning to emerge. And when America learned the details, the Donner Party would become one of the most infamous stories in the nation's history. By the spring of 1847, the Sierra Nevada mountains were finally beginning to loosen their grip. The endless winter that had imprisoned the Donner Party for months was slowly coming to an end. Snow still covered much of the landscape, but temperatures were rising. The rescue missions continued. Each trip brought more survivors out of the mountains. Yet a painful reality remained. Not everyone would leave alive. Among those still trapped was George Donner himself, the man whose name would forever become attached to the tragedy. Earlier in the journey, George had suffered a severe hand injury while repairing a wagon. At first, it seemed manageable, but as the months passed, the wound became infected. Without modern medicine, even a relatively minor injury could become life-threatening. By the time rescuers arrived, George Donner was too weak to travel. His wife, Tamsin Donner, faced an impossible choice. She could leave with the rescue party and save herself, or she could remain with her husband. Many expected her to go. No one would have blamed her. The mountains were still dangerous. The chances of survival were uncertain. But Tamsin made her decision. She stayed. She refused to abandon her husband. It was a choice that has fascinated historians for generations. An act of loyalty, an act of love, and ultimately, a fatal act. When later rescue parties reached the area, George Donner was dead. Tamsin Donner had also died. The exact details of her final days remain uncertain. But her decision to remain with her husband became one of the most remembered moments of the entire tragedy. Across the mountains, other stories emerged. Stories of parents sacrificing for children, children surviving against impossible odds, families torn apart by starvation and exposure. Every survivor carried a different memory. Every survivor had endured a different nightmare. But all of them shared one thing. They had witnessed something few human beings ever experience: the complete collapse of normal life. When the final rescue missions ended, the numbers revealed the true scale of the disaster. Approximately 87 people had entered the Sierra Nevada as part of the Donner Party. Only 48 survived. Nearly half were gone. Men, women, children. Entire families had been devastated. Some lost parents. Others lost spouses. Many lost friends they had known for years. The emotional damage could not be measured. The physical suffering had ended, but the psychological wounds remained. Survivors returned to California, carrying memories that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Many struggled to discuss what had happened. Some rarely spoke about it at all. Others spent years trying to explain their decisions, particularly the decisions made during the worst stages of starvation. Modern people often imagine they know how they would react in such circumstances. History suggests otherwise. The truth is uncomfortable. Extreme survival situations force human beings into choices they never expect to face. The Donner Party became a reminder of that reality. Not because the survivors were unusual, but because they were ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances. That may be the most frightening lesson of all. As survivors reached California, news of the tragedy spread rapidly. Newspapers seized upon the story. Readers across America became fascinated. The details seemed almost impossible to believe. Families trapped by snow, months of starvation, desperate rescue missions, and most shocking of all, reports that some survivors had resorted to cannibalism. For many Americans, that single detail overshadowed everything else. Headlines focused on it. Rumors exaggerated it. Stories grew more sensational with each retelling. Suddenly, the Donner Party became national news. Some people condemned the survivors. Others defended them. Public opinion was divided. Yet many observers overlooked an important fact. Most of the people making judgments had never faced starvation. They had never watched loved ones die from hunger. They had never been trapped in a frozen wilderness hundreds of miles from help. Historians today generally approach the subject differently. Rather than asking why desperate people made desperate decisions, they ask a more important question. How did the situation become so catastrophic in the first place? That question leads directly back to one man, Lansford Hastings, the promoter of the shortcut. The tragedy of the Donner Party cannot be understood without examining the Hastings Cutoff. The shortcut was supposed to save time. Instead, it cost weeks, weeks that proved fatal. Had the wagon train remained on the established route, many historians believe they would likely have crossed the Sierra Nevada before the heavy snow arrived. the disaster might never have happened. Of course, history is rarely that simple. Other factors contributed as well. The winter of 1846 to 1847 was unusually severe. The terrain was difficult. Communication was limited. Frontier travel was inherently dangerous. Yet the shortcut remained the critical turning point. One decision altered the timeline. One delay changed the outcome. One choice transformed a routine migration into a historic catastrophe. That lesson continues to resonate today. History often appears inevitable when viewed from the future, but in reality, major events frequently hinge on small decisions. A wrong turn, a delayed departure, a gamble that doesn't pay off. For the Donner Party, the shortcut became exactly that, a gamble, and the cost was enormous. Nearly 2 centuries have passed since the winter of 1846. The cabins are gone. The camps have disappeared. The snow that trapped the pioneers melted long ago. Yet the story remains alive. Today, travelers can visit the area around Donner Lake. The scenery is beautiful. The lake is calm. The mountains are breathtaking. On a clear summer day, it is difficult to imagine the suffering that once occurred there. But beneath that peaceful landscape lies one of America's most powerful survival stories. The Donner Party was not composed of famous explorers. They were not soldiers. They were not professional adventurers. They were ordinary families chasing a dream, a better future, more opportunity, a new beginning. In many ways, they represented the American spirit of their era, hopeful, determined, willing to take risks. But their story also serves as a warning. Ambition alone cannot overcome nature. Optimism cannot change reality. And sometimes, the smallest decisions create the largest consequences. The Donner Party entered the mountains believing they were only weeks away from success. Instead, they found themselves fighting for survival. Their experience revealed both the strength and fragility of human beings. The strength to endure unimaginable hardship. The fragility that emerges when food, warmth, and security disappear. And perhaps that is why their story continues to captivate people nearly 180 years later. Because beneath the history, beneath the tragedy, beneath the headlines, there is a question that still unsettles us today. A question every person must answer for themselves. If you were trapped in that frozen wilderness, if your family was starving, if rescue seemed impossible, how far would you go to survive?